Good morning. It is Wednesday. It's April 22nd. So we're going to keep going with the Federal Reserve System. In yesterday's presentation, we saw that there's 12 Federal Reserve districts. And one of the primary purposes of the Fed is to provide you confidence. So what we're going to do is I'm going to break down the different structure within the Fed, the different groups or committees. And we're going to go through the responsibilities of the Fed. So take some notes, jot some ideas down. But here's what you're going to find. Everything that we mention in here or discuss, you're going to see it benefit you. There's a reason that this is all designed to give you confidence, and how they've broken this down and the certain things that they perform is designed to protect you and to protect your money. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's get started here. So the Federal Reserve System has a variety of different committees. So the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, is without a doubt the most powerful committee in the Fed. And this is the committee that at one time the president of the Cleveland Fed chaired. So I'm just going to reveal to you all that they do. And then I'm going to talk about it as you're writing down. So first off, it consists of 12 members. All members of the Board of Governors, and we know there's 7, and then 5 district presidents. And they meet at the New York Fed. And here's why they meet at the New York Fed is because their function is to influence the money supply. And we know the money supply is made up of M1, M2, and M3. And we're talking about the flow of money. And the FOMC sets interest rates. So in order to do this, they need to have a real pulse on the financial situation, and the financial capital of the world is Wall Street. So this is why they meet in New York. So what the Fed does, or what the FOMC does, is to influence the money supply and to set interest rates. Is they monitor the flow of money, and monitors capitalized. The Fed does not print money. They do not make coins. It's called stamping coins. They don't do that. Another group does it, and then the Fed monitors the flow. So the group in charge of actually making our paper money, the notes, is the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. And the group, or the group that's in charge of making our coins is the Mint. So the FOMC controls the money supply. We're going to talk about it later. They're going to create policies. They're going to create policies to manipulate the flow of money. So that's all for you. Remember, I told you a fast flow sometimes is good, but a lot of times it can be dangerous. A slow flow can be dangerous. So they're going to monitor the flow. This is so you get the most for your money. So here's the next group. Whoops. Sorry, one too many. Let me get rid of that. So the next group is the Federal Advisory Committee. And this council meets in Washington, D.C. And what they do is they get a major banker from each of the 12 districts, where each of those major bankers provide them on what's going on in their area. As we know, different areas around the country have been impacted differently by this COVID virus. Different areas in our country face different economic issues as well. So what they do is they try to inform the Board of Governors and give advice on what's going on in their area and what could be done to help them. So again, now they're looking out. So whoever represents us from Cleveland, which is D4, they're there to promote us. This is what D4 needs. This is what's going to help you. It's going to help me. It's going to help your parents. This is what we need. And then collectively as a group, the Fed will make some advice. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'm going to show you there you go, the whole thing there. And then they have a Consumer Advisory Council. And this is what they do. They give information related to consumers and consumer credit. They're the ones that have said that the average household is over $8,000 in credit card debt. And they're the ones that say, look, we are over our head in debt between mortgages and car loans and credit card loans and student loans. We need to do something to help these people. They are trying to create, and we'll get to it, they're trying to create legislation from this information to help you, the consumer. So again, I can't see how the FOMC, the Federal Advisory Council, the Consumer Advisory Council, it's all, I can't see how it hurts us. It's all for us. So they can create policy for us. And here's the last one. So before I reveal the whole thing, I'll just reveal it. We know that thrifts are the other types of banks. So you have commercial banks, the big banks, which all are required to follow the Fed. Then we have thrifts, savings and loans, savings banks, and credit unions. Thrifts, first off, cater to the individual. Thrifts, by choice, choose to join the Fed. Not all thrifts do. Majority do. But so they have their own little group. So the Federal Advisory Council is made up of bankers. They tell them about banking matters. The Thrift Advisory Council tells them about matters related to people that bank with them. So again, so everybody now is being spoken for. So this is really good because we have advocates across the board at all levels. Again, and this is to give us confidence in the banking system. This is so the Fed can create policy to help the banking system. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at, there's 12 of them. We're going to take a look at the 12 responsibilities of the Fed. So I'll keep it brief. But first off, we talked about they conduct bank examinations. Any bank that's a member of the Fed gets examined once a year. Okay, the main bank, not each bank individually, the main bank gets examined to make sure your money's being taken care of, see if there's any issues, stuff like that. So what if you're not a bank? If you're not a bank, you're called a holding company. So holding companies are groups that own banks. And this is what I mean. So if I owned another business, you know, that business is monitored, but maybe I'm not monitored per se. So if I owned a bank, for whatever reason, if I owned a bank, I might not have to follow the same regulations because my main business isn't a bank, if that makes sense. Let me give you an example. Ally, A-L-L-Y, Ally Financial Services is not a bank. They're a lending institution. Ally owns some banks, okay? So under the umbrella of Ally falls these other businesses, and one of them's a bank. But because Ally, who's the ultimate owner, is not a bank, they're not subject to all the bank regulations. So, but because they own a bank, the Fed goes and checks on them, and they make sure that they're doing everything properly. Hopefully that makes sense. Bottom line, what they're doing again is they're protecting your money. They're protecting your loans. They're doing stuff like that. So now, if we have some international banks, and I have Toronto Dominion there and some other one that I can't pronounce from in Texas, when foreign banks come into our country, they're a foreign-based bank. Ebner Furnace is a foreign-based company. Ebner's on the west side of town. It's just the other side of Route 57. Ebner's corporate headquarters are in Austria. Okay, so they just happen to have a facility here. So they're going to follow American rules and Ohio rules and Wadsworth rules and laws and stuff like that. But they are out. They're in a different country, so they may operate differently over there. But while they're here, they have to follow our rules. So while Toronto Dominion follows Canadian rules when it comes to banking, their bank here in the United States has to follow our American rules. So if you bank there, then again, be rest assured that your money is being watched over by our rules and not a different country's rules. So that's good. So they supervise bank mergers. So when Huntington merged with First Merit, their supervision came, and it's not so much a monopoly, making sure nobody had a monopoly, because there's so many banks that wasn't going to happen. But here's what they did. So when I had an account at First Merit, And when Huntington took us over, I had a choice. I go with Huntington or I withdraw all my money and go to another bank. But I also had a loan through First Merit. And when the banks merged together, so First Merit was taken over by Huntington. Huntington could not change the rules of my loan. They couldn't change the rules of my savings account unless I gave them permission. They couldn't change any rules. They assumed all my rules and stuff that I had at First Merit when they took over my accounts. So they supervise bank mergers. And guys, this is the best part. You could choose. If Huntington had better interest rates, I could choose then. Okay, I'm going to fall under the Huntington's savings interest rates, et cetera, or I could stay with First Merit. It really becomes your choice. Here's one thing they do. They create laws as it relates to loans. So it's called truth in lending laws. So all sellers must make full disclosure to individuals who buy on credit. All sellers must make full disclosure. So when you go to sell a house, you must have full disclosure of issues within your home. You get water in the basement. I don't know. You've had pipes break. You have to disclose all of that stuff to the buyer, so they can make the most informed decision. Because here's the bottom line. If they find out they get into a house that has all kinds of issues and they got to get it fixed and they can't afford it, then that house loses in value. And because basically they borrow money to buy the home, and if they can't maintain the home, that house has lost value. And if they would be foreclosed on, then that person that loaned the money out, they're not going to be able to get as much money back. So truth in lending laws are designed to protect the buyer, which is brilliant. They're designed to protect you guys to get a loan. Everything must be disclosed. And if it's not, if you find out it's not, you might have to go to court. That might cost you a little bit, but you can fight those. And it's very easy to fight issues like that. So they took this truth in lending laws. They said, you know what? Let's go beyond. And this is typical for homes and stuff. Let's go beyond homes and let's extend it to cars. And then you put in what was called Regulation Z. So here's the bottom line. You can't crack open your odometer and roll your miles back. Okay, Carfax is somewhat accurate, and what Carfax does is anytime work is done on a car, repair, body work, stuff like that, you're supposed to register it on Carfax. You're supposed to register it, and you use the vehicle identification number, which is way tucked underneath your windshield, and you're supposed to register it that way. But what they do is they've extended it to cars, because your first major purchase, most of you guys are going to make, is a car. So you want to get the best possible car. So here's another thing they do. They clear checks. So I don't know how many of you write checks, and I don't know if you really paid attention to it. But so if I wrote a check today, and I wrote a check to you, today's April 17th, and I gave it to you, I might write down in my checkbook, April 17th is the date I wrote, I don't know, Erica Palladar a check for $50. Apparently she thinks I owe her $50. So I write Erica a check for $50. And I give it to her. So she goes to the bank, let's say tomorrow, and cashes it. She gets her $50 back. That check then is sent to the Fed, where it's processed and cleared. When I get my bank statement, it might say, today's the 17th, it might say April 20th, April 21st. That's the date the money's officially pulled from my account. The only person that has the authority to transfer money from one account to the other is the Fed. That's to protect you. Okay. So even though Erica got her money, even though she got it, the money hasn't been transferred to her bank for a couple more days. And then if the check would bounce and all that other stuff, there's other issues that we deal with, but they clear checks. You're the only ones allowed to clear checks. So what they do is they issue currency. And what I mean by issue currencies, they don't create it, they put it out in circulation. So now the Fed's going to regulate the flow of money. Hey, if they want less $1 bills in circulation, they just issue less. I wish if we saw a video, you would see they shred old money. So when they shred a dollar bill, they release a dollar bill. So let's say they want to slow down the flow of $1 bill. So when they shred a dollar bill, let's say they, for every $2, for every two $1 bills they shred, they release one. Or they shred one and they release two if they want to increase the flow. It's up to the Fed. The only one that's allowed to put money out in circulation that currently isn't in circulation is the Fed. Okay. They regulate margins, and I'm going to kind of click through this and talk about it really quick. Here's what a margin is. A margin, for all practical purposes, is a down payment when you buy stock. So the Fed determines how much the margin is going to be. So if you go and buy $100 worth of stock and the margin's 10%, you must pay $10 up front. And then you get the stock. And then you could actually, guys, you could get loans on the rest of it. Or maybe that they'll go up to 80%. So out of the $100, I owe them 80 up front in order to get the stock. And the reason they fluctuate the margin. So right now, and I'm guessing, as the stock market's up and down and it's bouncing all over the place, maybe they've raised the margin. And by raising the margin, so if I want to sell my stock, or better yet, if I want to buy stock, I need to have cash in hand in order to do it. So maybe it becomes harder to buy $10,000 worth of stock when I have to put 80% down, when I have to put $8,000 down that day. Where if it's $10,000 worth of stock at 10%, I could give them $1,000. So what they're trying to do is prevent the market from collapsing. Short of the government shutting the market down, this is what the Fed can do to slow down people. I don't want to say overreacting, but people reacting to the current situation. They mess, bottom line, kind of with the down payment that's needed when you buy stock. So another responsibility or function of the Fed is the federal government is the only one that actually has bank accounts at the Fed. In this regard, that's their only bank. Okay, that's their only bank. The government banks there. Now banks bank at the Fed as well. So banks can deposit money at the Fed. No individual can, but the federal government doesn't bank. We'll just say Huntington. I always use Huntington, but they don't bank in Huntington, and Huntington transfers the money over. Wadsworth City Schools banks at Huntington, but the government doesn't. The government banks with the Fed. So we're almost done here. So the Fed acts as a lender of last resort. So the Fed allows banks to lend each other money. So somebody might say, why would a bank seek a loan from another bank? It's so maybe they could make a loan themselves. So let's use Wadsworth Schools. So when we went to build our new schools, the cost was $100-some million. Okay, now that's not just the high school. That was the 3 elementaries we built as well. It was $100-some million. So let's say that they went to Fifth Third Bank to get $150 million loan, and Fifth Third didn't have $150 million to loan out. So instead of sending them to another bank, what Fifth Third would do is they would borrow $150 million, and then they would give that $150 million to Wadsworth City Schools. So Wadsworth City Schools, I'm going to make up the interest rates. Wadsworth City Schools gets $150 million at 4%. Well, Fifth Third borrowed it at what's called the federal funds rate. That is what the interest rate that banks charge each other. Maybe they get it for 2%. So they got to pay 2% to Fifth Third, or to whomever. They have to pay 2% there, and then Wadsworth City Schools pays them 4%. So they're still making a little bit of money. And on $100-some million, they're making quite a bit of money in interest. So the federal funds rate is the interest rate at which banks can borrow money. Sometimes banks just need to borrow money because they're in trouble. Just like sometimes we need to take out a second mortgage or equity line of credit just because we need it. We don't, banks aren't going to advertise they've done this, but that's what they do. And then sometimes the banks go directly to the Fed, and they borrow money from the Fed, and they borrow at the discount rate. So this is the discount rate is the Fed is the last person you want to go to. So what I would ask you in class is, if you had to borrow money from your parents, mom or dad, which one would you go to? Which one's the most likely to give you money right off the bat? And if you answered your mom, then that's kind of like going to another bank to get the money. Okay. Who would you least likely go to? If you answered your dad, then that's like going to the Fed. Here's the reason why. Fed's never going to borrow money from the banks. Okay. But if I go to them, they're going to ask me a lot of questions, and maybe I've raised some red flags, so to speak. But maybe I go to another bank and borrow money. I'm a bank myself. So bank A goes to bank B to borrow money. Why would bank B loan them money? Because maybe one day bank B needs a loan and they're going to go back to bank A. So you go to the Fed as the absolute last resort. But if you go to the Fed, you borrow at what's called the discount rate. Okay. So when the Fed drops interest rates, they drop what's called the federal funds rate, or they drop the discount rate. Typically, they do it in tandem. But when they lower rates, that's what they lower. They don't lower your mortgage rate, but it becomes a trickle-down effect. But once the Fed does that and they announce it, and they always announce when they do stuff like this, it's called moral suasion. It like gets the word out there. So they announce it, and if they're dropping interest rates, somebody says, hey, I could go buy something now. So two more things. They set the reserve ratio. We know banks operate under fractional banking, and that fraction is the reserve ratio. So the Fed is the one that sets that ratio. Sometimes they set it across the board for everybody. They raise it by 1%, they lower it by 1%, whatever they do. And sometimes individually, they'll go to different banks and say, you know what, you haven't been responsible. I'm going to raise your reserve ratio, and you're going to have to keep more money on hand until you can prove that you can handle what I give you. Okay. So when they do it across the board, that's typically, that will be known publicly. But when they do it independently for different banks, that's very private. Because if you knew what reserve ratio was, and if it was advertised that, hey, they just raised the reserve ratio at Huntington Bank, and if you knew what the reserve ratio was, what would pop into my mind is they've done something wrong. They're not trusting them with their money. They made some bad decisions. And then I might decide to pull my money out of Huntington Bank. And here's the last thing, which leads into Thursday's lecture and stuff. They regulate the money supply. They create what's called monetary policy. So I'm going to click out of this, and we're going to go into great detail on monetary policy here in a moment. So stop sharing my screen. So I went quick, but hopefully you see that everything they do, from the different committees to the 12 responsibilities of Fed, it all comes back to you. It helps you. Okay. It allows you certain protections. So it's not, most aren't going to find it very interesting, stuff like that. But I find it hard to believe that what they do does not benefit you. Okay. So hopefully you got something out of this. I will create a couple questions from here, and I might ask you what color shirt I have on right here as one of the quiz questions. Not the sweater, but the shirt. Hopefully you're not colorblind, and you can see Mr. Austin's colorblind. Hopefully you're not. So I will talk to you guys later. Have a great day. Bye.